This case was hidden because it involved abuse of power and a deliberate cover-up. But today I will tell you how a simple caregiver's greed unraveled a shadow operation that spanned years. For years, no one dared to speak of it, until I dug through the archives and found that one forgotten file, marked only as Operation Red Moon, that changed everything. It started in Akron, Ohio, where I was assigned to investigate a series of suspicious deaths in a local nursing home. The first red flag was an elderly patient, Michael Carter, who suddenly died after signing a series of documents, 5 to be exact, that mysteriously transferred his estate to someone named Danielle Ruiz, a nurse's aide. The paperwork was strange, out of order, inconsistent signatures, and, most alarming, overlapping wills that all favored her. Would you have noticed this detail in the file? The signatures looked altered, but the handwriting was so similar. Was it forged or just sloppy? It was enough to set me on a deeper dive. What I uncovered next was chilling. Danielle Ruiz was not just a nurse's aide. She was part of a network, a shadow operation that forged, manipulated, and erased wills, sometimes even before the patient's death, using the guise of caregiving. Their method was insidious. They relied on the trust families placed in these caregivers, exploiting the quiet, routine moments of helplessness. And the rules? Silence was golden. There was an unspoken code. If you saw too much, you disappeared from the records, or worse. The patients, unregistered minors, ghost patients, vanished from official logs, replaced by shadow files. This was a well-oiled machine, fueled by fraud, extortion, and secret commissions from shadow clinics operating out of strip malls across the city. But how deep did this go? I traced Danielle's connections, family members who knew but pretended not to. Her brother, Marcus Hall, was a local attorney, allegedly unaware of her activities. But I found court records, sealed of course, that hinted at his complicity. Did they think the system wouldn't notice? Or was it more sinister? As I followed the trail, I encountered a coded language, a ritual of silence among the insiders. They called it keeping the moon, a euphemism for the unspoken agreement. Don't ask questions, don't blow the cover. The operation had a reputation for ruthlessness, but it thrived on secrecy. Then came the betrayal. A whistleblower, someone who worked inside the shadow clinics, reached out, confiding that Danielle had forged her 5th will on her latest patient, an elderly man named William Jenkins. The will was signed on a stolen ID with manipulated signatures. The man had no family, but his estate was substantial, enough to attract greed on an industrial scale. I questioned Danielle directly, but she played innocent, claiming she was just a compassionate caregiver. But her alibi was thin. Meanwhile, her shadow network was fraying at the edges. Rumors spread of arrests, of internal conflicts. Did I doubt myself then? Of course. I wondered if I was chasing ghosts, if this was just a small-town scandal blown out of proportion. But the evidence kept piling up. More wills, more erased files, a pattern that couldn't be coincidence. By the time I obtained the case files from the DA's office, case number 2011-04567, the picture was clear. Danielle Ruiz had orchestrated at least 5 estate transfers, all benefiting herself or her immediate family. The deaths were not natural. They were carefully timed, manipulated by her hand, disguised by the veneer of caregiving. And yet she vanished before the cuffs could close. She disappeared into the system, foster homes, re-education programs, who knows. Her trail went cold, but her shadow lingered. Why do I tell you this? Because this wasn't just about a greedy nurse. It was about a network of silence and complicity, about how trust can be exploited, how the system is vulnerable to those who understand its cracks. Would you have believed the official story? That these were just isolated incidents? Think again. This was a carefully constructed web, hidden behind the facade of care and compassion. A conspiracy so deep, it almost felt protected by the very laws meant to safeguard the vulnerable. If this had happened in your family, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the official explanation? Or would you have looked deeper, questioned the records, demanded transparency? What looks most suspicious to you in this story? The forged signatures, the sealed court records, the shadow clinics? Or perhaps the silence from authorities that knew but refused to act? Why do you think this was hidden for so long? Because exposing it would have shaken the foundations of trust. Trust that keeps this entire system alive. And who benefits from silence? The same entities that profited from the fraud. If this case were investigated today, how do you think it would end? Would justice finally be served, or would the shadows still hold their secrets? I solved more than one case, and this is only the beginning. There are layers upon layers of deception buried beneath the surface of what we're told. This file was never meant to be released. Subscribe while it's still accessible, because every day I'll post a real case from my archive, investigations I solved that still unsettle me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment. These files rarely survive to the end. Stay safe. See you tomorrow. But even as I closed the case, I knew this story wasn't over. The deeper I looked, the more I realized how many threads were still loose, dangling in the shadows. Danielle Ruiz had become a ghost, but her network, her family, was still out there, lurking behind the curtains of the healthcare system. In the months that followed, I tracked the flow of money, cryptocurrency transactions, shell companies registered under false names, shadow clinics that operated under the radar of state licensing boards. These were not isolated entities. They were parts of a sprawling, clandestine operation that used the guise of elderly care to siphon millions, laundering profits through fake estates and ghost assets. Would you have noticed the subtle signs? The sudden appearance of untraceable bank accounts linked to the shadow clinics? The irregularities in patient records that didn't match hospital logs? I did, but I questioned whether anyone else saw them, or if they chose to ignore what was right in front of them. And then there was the family side. The families who trusted their loved ones to these caregivers, never suspecting that the very people they relied on were orchestrating their worst nightmares. I found one case where a grieving daughter, Lisa Monroe, uncovered her mother's estate had been drained, her mother's will wiped clean, replaced by a forged document. She had no idea her mother's caregiver was part of a network that had been manipulating her family's lives for years. Did I regret not catching this sooner? Sometimes. But I also know how easy it is for these schemes to operate under the radar, especially when they're protected by layers of false compliance, untraceable funds, and the complicity of insiders. The betrayal was complete when I discovered that some of the caregivers, the ones trusted with patients' lives, were actually involved in blackmail, extortion, even orchestrated accidents to cover their tracks. They used fear as a weapon, threatening families who dared to ask questions, silencing whistleblowers before they could reveal the truth. I remember a particular meeting with a retired detective from Fresno who told me about a similar case, an elder in a shadow clinic who died mysteriously after signing a new will. He whispered that these networks are protected by a code of silence. Keep the moon, and that breaking it can cost lives, careers, even freedom. The question nags at me now. How many more of these cases are hidden? How many families are still unaware of the silent predators lurking behind the caregiving facade? And the worst part, how many of these crimes are still unresolved, still unpunished? I often wonder if the authorities ever really wanted to uncover the truth, or if they were content to let this story fade away. There's always a reason why some cases are buried: fear, corruption, or convenience. But I know this much: the system is vulnerable, and if we don't look beneath the surface, it will keep feeding on the trust of the innocent. Would you have believed this story if you heard it directly from the files? That behind the masks of kindness, there are networks built on greed, betrayal, and silence. That a caregiver, someone supposed to protect, can turn into a predator, forging wills and rewriting destinies with a pen and a forged signature. And what about you? If this had happened in your family, what would you have done? Would you have questioned the official story, demanded transparency, looked for hidden clues, or would you have accepted the silence, the grief, the unspoken complicity? This isn't just a story about one nurse or one estate. It's a mirror, reflecting the cracks in our system, the unseen dangers that we choose to ignore. That's the real horror. And I can tell you this: the files I've uncovered are only the surface. There are layers deeper still, more names, more secrets, more crimes buried in the shadows of the healthcare system. Would you like to see what I found in the last unopened folder? Or are you ready to stop digging before you find something you can't unsee? Remember, every day, these investigations I've pieced together are still happening somewhere, hidden behind closed doors, under the guise of care. And I'm the only one left who remembers the truth. This file was never meant to be released. Subscribe while it's still accessible, because the next chapter, more dark secrets, more betrayals, awaits just beneath the surface. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and I'll see you tomorrow with another story from the shadows. As I sifted through the remaining fragments of the case, I discovered something even more disturbing: an elaborate web of cover-ups that extended beyond Ohio. The patterns pointed toward a nationwide operation, hidden in plain sight. Shadow clinics, unregulated and off the books, operated in dozens of states: California, Texas, New York, places where the healthcare system's cracks were exploited for profit. I uncovered a series of encrypted communications between Danielle Ruiz and an anonymous contact, codenamed the Broker. These exchanges revealed that the estate manipulations weren't isolated. They were part of a larger scheme to funnel money into untraceable accounts. The wills she forged weren't just about greed. They were part of a broader, organized effort to control assets across state lines. Would you have questioned the official records if you saw these encrypted messages? Did it seem plausible that a single caregiver could orchestrate such an expansive operation alone? Or was she merely a small part of something much bigger? I remember one particular night poring over bank transaction logs, finding transfers that coincided with the deaths of dozens of elderly patients, money moving from shadow clinics to shell companies, then vanishing into offshore accounts. It was money laundering on a scale that made my head spin, all under the guise of elder care, masked behind the trust families placed in caregivers. And the families? How many of them knew? How many still don't suspect that the estate their loved one left behind has been stolen, manipulated, erased? I looked into the family of William Jenkins, the elderly man whose forged will started this entire investigation, and found his daughter, Susan Jenkins, living in Queens. She had no idea her father's estate had been drained. She thought he died of natural causes, as the report claimed. Would you have believed that the system failed her? That her father's death was not just natural, but part of a calculated scheme to eliminate witnesses? It's easy to dismiss these stories as conspiracy theories, but the evidence I held in my hands told a different story. The deeper I went, the more I realized how the rule of silence, keeping the moon, was enforced by fear. Whistleblowers disappeared, files were altered, witnesses were threatened. I uncovered a covert operation within certain law enforcement agencies, some officers on the payroll, others simply too afraid or complicit to act. I recall a conversation with a former FBI agent who warned me that exposing this network could cost me everything: my career, my safety. But I'd seen enough to know that the truth cannot be buried forever. It's just waiting, hidden behind layers of deception. The fall came suddenly. An informant within the shadow clinics was arrested, an intern caught trying to delete files, but by then, Danielle Ruiz had already vanished, leaving behind a trail of false identities and fake documents. Her last known location was in a small town in Texas, Travis County, where she was rumored to be working under a new alias. Would you have followed her? Would you have risked everything to bring her in? Or would you have hesitated, knowing how powerful the unseen forces behind her truly are? I regret not catching her sooner, not exposing the full scope of her operation before she disappeared. Because I knew then, this was only the beginning. The corruption runs deep, far beyond one caregiver or one estate. It's a systemic rot, a cancer that feeds on trust, on the vulnerable, on the very fabric of our society. And yet, even now, I wonder, how many more Danielle Ruiz are out there? How many more silent killers disguised as caregivers? How many families are still unknowingly living under the shadow of this silent conspiracy? This is why I keep digging. This is why I reveal what I can, even if it's dangerous. Because the truth, once uncovered, has a way of leaking out, like this file, which I've kept hidden for years, now slipping through the cracks. Would you believe me if I told you that the worst part isn't just the crimes? It's the silence that protects them, that the real horror lies in what we refuse to see, what we choose to ignore? If you've listened this far, if you're still here, then you're searching for the truth. Subscribe because I have more files, more stories that should never have been exposed. And if you think this is just about one nurse, one estate, one city, think again. This is a pattern, a shadow war that's been waged in the quiet corners of the system, and it's still ongoing. This file was never meant to be released. Subscribe while you still can, because the next chapter is waiting, and it's worse than you think. Stay cautious, stay questioning, and I'll see you tomorrow with another revelation from the darkest archives. But the story doesn't end there. As I kept digging, I uncovered a chilling pattern. These estate manipulations, these forged wills, they weren't confined to Danielle Ruiz or Akron. They were part of a nationwide operation, hidden beneath the surface of legitimate elder care networks. Shadow clinics and unlicensed care providers operated in every corner of the country, from Fresno to Queens, from small towns in Texas to coastal California. I found evidence of a chain, an interconnected web of individuals and shell companies, all linked through encrypted communications and untraceable transactions. The common denominator was their shared goal: siphoning off assets from vulnerable seniors, then disappearing before the law could catch up. Their method was simple: co-opt a caregiver, manipulate or forge legal documents, then launder the stolen wealth through complex offshore accounts. Would you have believed this was happening in your own country? That your elderly parents or grandparents could be targeted by a hidden syndicate disguised as benevolent caretakers? The truth is, most families remain blindly trusting, unaware that their loved ones are sitting ducks in a system riddled with rot. I traced the trail to a shadow entity I dubbed the Network, a loose federation of fraudsters and corrupt insiders who profited from the chaos. They operated through a series of safe houses, front companies, and fake agencies that looked legitimate to outsiders, all orchestrated by a mysterious figure known only as the Broker, who maintained communication channels encrypted and untraceable. In one of my most startling discoveries, I found that some of the forged wills weren't just about theft. They were used to silence witnesses. One elderly man who had refused to sign over his estate suddenly died, an apparent stroke. But I uncovered evidence that his caregiver had used a fake will to disinherit his heirs, and that the supposed medical cause of death was fabricated. If you had been in my position, would you have questioned the official reports or taken them at face value? Because I learned that in this game, the truth is often the last thing anyone wants exposed. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deeply embedded this network was, protected by layers of complicity in law enforcement, judiciary, and even some political circles. I encountered a retired judge, a man who once presided over probate cases, who confided in me that some of these estate disputes were settled behind closed doors. Families paid off, witnesses threatened, and the operation kept running smoothly. And then there was Danielle Ruiz herself. After her initial disappearance, I learned she resurfaced under a different identity in a small Texas town, working as a caregiver for a private family. I tracked her movements via subtle surveillance, but every time I closed in, she vanished again, like a ghost slipping through the cracks of the system. Would you have kept pursuing her, or would you have given up knowing how powerful her network was? I ask myself that question every day, because these people are not just criminals, they are predators, feeding off the trust and vulnerability of our elders. I regret that I couldn't bring her in sooner. The longer she remained free, the more lives she and her network could ruin. But I also know that confronting such a web of corruption is like fighting shadows, dangerous, uncertain, and often futile. And yet, I kept going. I subpoenaed bank records, traced cryptocurrency wallets, infiltrated online forums where insiders exchanged tips. I discovered that some shadow clinics operated out of unmarked warehouses, hidden behind legitimate-looking storefronts. They employed unlicensed personnel, often under the influence of drugs or coercion, to carry out their schemes. This wasn't just about money. It was about control over the dying, the helpless, the trust of entire communities. And it was thriving because no one was really looking. No one wanted to believe that the most sacred institutions, family, care, trust, could be so easily exploited. I remember a chilling conversation I had with an FBI agent who told me, "If these networks are allowed to operate unchecked, we're looking at a future where the elderly are nothing more than commodities, assets on paper, disposable in practice." That's not a world I want to imagine. So I ask you, if your own family was targeted, what would you do? Would you accept the official story, or would you suspect something darker? Because the truth is, these crimes are designed to stay hidden, to avoid detection at all costs. Why do you think this was kept secret for so long? Because exposing it would threaten powerful interests, those profiting from the chaos, those who prefer silence over justice. And I've seen how hard it is to fight against that entrenched silence. This is why I keep revealing what I've uncovered, because these files, these stories, are pieces of a puzzle that the system desperately tries to hide. But every piece I find, every secret I expose, gets us closer to the truth. And if you think this is just about a few bad actors, think again. This is a systemic failure, one that's happening right now in ways you can't see, to people you'll never hear about. Would you have believed me if I told you that the real threat isn't just the criminals, but the widespread corruption that shields them? That a caregiver, someone trusted, can turn into a silent predator, forging wills and rewriting destinies with a pen? And what about you? Would you have the courage to look deeper, to question everything, or would you turn away, content with the sanitized version until it's too late? This is the hidden war, a battle fought in quiet corridors and sealed records, but the truth is, it's still happening, and I am still uncovering it. This file was never meant to be released. Subscribe while I still can, because the next chapter, more dark truths, more betrayals, waits just beneath the surface. Stay cautious, stay questioning, and I'll see you tomorrow with another chapter from the shadows.